Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Silver Hill Grand Rounds. Thanks for joining today. I'm just going to give a little pause as we all settle into our Zoom cells. I'll watch as people settle in, like Jiffy Pop popping, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Jeff Katzman. I'm the Director of Education here at Silver Hill Hospital. We are absolutely delighted to have you join us for our virtual Grand Rounds today, and are pleased to welcome back Dr. Petros Levounis, presenting on the topic Technological Addictions, the New Frontier of Addiction Psychiatry. And I will have the honor of introducing him in a moment. First, I wanted to let you know what's in our education pipeline for May. We have two Grand Rounds. The first is May 11th, when we welcome one of my colleagues from New Mexico, Dr. Bill Miller, who will be one of the founders of motivational interviewing, who will be speaking to us. And then another colleague of mine, Dr. Alan Abbas, will be talking to us on May 25th about intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy. These, just like today, will be tremendous Grand Rounds. I'm very grateful for all of these folks joining us and all of you as well. Our upcoming Grand Rounds can be found on our website calendar under the resources and blogs section. So please check that out. And so back to today, we would love to hear from you. Dr. Andrew Gerber and I will moderate a Q&A discussion with Dr. Levounis toward the end of the lecture. You'll have an opportunity to put your questions and comments in throughout the lecture using the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. So as always, just submit a question anytime during the lecture, either with your name, or if you prefer, you can submit it anonymously. And we will facilitate that conversation toward the end of the presentation. To receive CME and CEU credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will pop up in the browser when the webinar ends. Finally, disclosures. All of the planners, speakers, individuals in control of content for this educational activity have no relevant financial relationships to disclose with ineligible companies whose primary business is producing, marketing, selling, reselling, or distributing healthcare products used by or on patients. It is now my tremendous pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Petros Levounis, and a bit about our speaker. Dr. Levounis serves as Professor and Chair of the Department of Psychiatry and Associate Dean for Professional Development at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. He is also the Chief of Service at University Hospital in Newark, New Jersey. He came to Rutgers from Columbia University, where he served as Director of the Addiction Institute of New York from 2002 to 2013. He is also President-elect of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Levounis is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Stanford University, where he studied chemistry and biophysics before receiving his medical education at Stanford University School of Medicine and the Medical College of Pennsylvania. And we were just chatting a little bit of fun, realizing that we started Stanford University as undergrads on the very same day in buildings just adjacent to each other and have some common friends. So joy for me already today. So during medical school, Dr. Levounis researched the effects of social class on patient-physician relationships in Oxford, England, and received a master's degree in sociology from Stanford. In 1994, he moved to New York City to train in psychiatry at the New York State Psychiatric Institute of Columbia University. He graduated from Columbia, earning the National Institute of Mental Health Outstanding Resident Award, and went on to complete his fellowship in addiction psychiatry at New York University. He has written numerous articles, monographs, and book chapters, and has lectured extensively on addiction topics throughout the United States and abroad. He has been interviewed by CBS, ABC, NBC, CNN, Fox, the Martha Stewart Radio Show, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others. We also have a copy of his most recent book in our library. Dr. Levounis has served on the boards of the American Society of Addiction Medicine and the American Board of Addiction Medicine, and from 2005 to 2009, he chaired the National Committee on Addiction Treatment of the American Psychiatric Association. He is a Betty Ford Scholar, a recipient of the Association of Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists Distinguished Service Award, and the ASAM Educator of the Year Award, and a distinguished fellow of the APA and ASAM. In 2017, he was elected as an honorary member of the World Psychiatric Association. Dr. Levounis has published 14 books, including the self-help paperback, Sober Siblings, How to Help Your Alcoholic Brother or Sister and Not Lose Yourself, the textbook of Substance Dependence and Co-occurring Psychiatric Disorders, Motivational Interviewing for Clinical Practice, The Behavioral Addictions, Becoming Mindful, LGBTQ Mental Health, The Spectrum of Gender and Sexuality, Office-Based Buprenorphine Treatment of Opioid Use Disorder, now in its second edition, and Technological Addictions. Dr. Levounis is currently working on the first textbook of nature therapy, which is going to be available in 2022. His books have been translated into French, German, Hungarian, Japanese, Portuguese, and Spanish, and he is married to actor Lucas Hassel and lives in New York City. Dr. Levounis, it is a complete honor to have you join us today. I am going to turn to you to teach us and inform us, and then Dr. Gerber and I will reappear at the conclusion to have a chat.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff and Andrew, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure coming back to Silver Hill. I've given grand rounds a few times, and every time is really great, meeting new people and seeing some old friends. So thank you very much for having me back. All right, so today we're going to be talking about technological addictions, the new frontier in addiction psychiatry. I have no disclosures, and the way I propose we do that is start with some general concepts of the lay of the land of the technological addictions, and then I would like to spend a little more time on two of the technological addictions, internet gaming and cybersex. They're the ones that tend to have the most data behind them, and we know just a bit more than the other technological addictions. Then we're going to go through a very well-traveled routes of assessment and diagnosis, a few ideas about treatments before we conclude. Let's do this. I'm always very aware not to run out of time. In this case today, I don't think we have to worry too much about that, because our knowledge base of the technological addictions is really not all that vast. And the book that we wrote on technological addictions ended up being the smallest one that we have, again, because the database is not really there yet. But we're getting there. All right, so let's start with the context, the lay of the land. Technological addictions belong in the behavioral addictions, and the essential feature, the hallmark of the behavioral addictions is a failure to resist an impulse, drive, or temptation to do something that creates havoc either in the person herself or himself or the people around them. You can just hear the echo of the definition of mental illness of the DSM. Something, in order to be really pathological, has to either devastate us, like depression, and or the people around us. Again, depression could be a good example there, but this is how DSM really views mental illness. So the behavioral addictions have as a hallmark the failure to resist a repetitive dysfunctional act. Okay, so we all agree with that. That's great. However, we do distinguish two different paths, two different routes to get to this repetitive dysfunctional act: a path of impulsivity and a path of compulsivity. And these concepts will become particularly helpful towards the end of the presentation today when we talk about pharmacological treatments. All right, let's describe those. A purely impulsive act has the following profile. You're happy-go-lucky, nothing good, nothing bad is happening in your life. You go through life, and then boom, you see something that attracts your attention, you grab it, you make it yours, and you emerge on the other side cool as a cucumber. A purely impulsive act. you can think of antisocial personality disorder, perhaps having this most extreme impulsivity as part of its makeup. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a purely compulsive act, and that has a very different profile. I start thinking about the dysfunctional act, I ruminate about it, I obsess about it, I become more and more and more anxious, I think about it, I resist. The anxiety escalates. It reaches a point where I cannot resist anymore. I perform the dysfunctional act, all the anxiety completely resolves, and then starts building up again. And often that kind of compulsive act does come with significant remorse, a purely compulsive act. At that extreme of the spectrum, you can think about obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders, where people really obsess and then boom, they perform the compulsion and the anxiety resolves, only to start up again. Bookends. These are the two extremes, the two bookends, and then we can map the behavioral addictions somewhere along that spectrum. Here are the behavioral addictions, at least how we formulated them in 2015. Gambling, sex, technology, food, shopping, tanning, exercise, and work. There are other ways of cutting the pie, but these were the ones that seem to have the most evidence behind them. I put gambling and sex in green because gambling made it officially in the DSM-5. It is part of the chapter on substance use disorders and other addictive disorders, and gambling is now a formal disorder that moved out of the impulsivity chapter into the addiction chapter, and we're delighted about that. Sex did not make the DSM-5, and it's a very a convoluted story about why it did not make it into the DSM-5. There were raging disagreements about hypersexuality disorder and sexual addiction and this and that. People thought about having it in section C of the DSM. In any case, it ended up not being in the DSM-5 at all, but the evidence is there, and most of us do agree that there is such thing as sex addiction, and there's a good, very, very good chance that it will make it into the DSM-6. Technology does come into the DSM-5 with the internet gaming disorder in section C, in the section for disorders that need more work. And of course, this is the topic of today's presentation. Food, shopping, tanning, exercise, and work fall somewhere in that spectrum of impulsivity, compulsivity that I mentioned before. And what we think in 2022 is that each one of these behavioral addictions probably has a more impulsive presentation, a more impulsive form, and a more compulsive form. So it's not that each individual behavioral addiction lives somewhere in that spectrum. It's more that each one of these behavioral addictions can morph or can occupy a space closer to the impulsivity or the compulsivity end of the spectrum. Take, for example, gambling. You can think about highly impulsive gamblers, the bigger-than-life people who come into the casino and they roll the dice and they just become like, you know, the kings of the casino for a second before they lose all their money, very much on the impulsive end of the spectrum. And contrast that with the one-armed bandits, the people who play the slots over and over and over and over and over and over and over again in a much more compulsive fashion, clearly on the compulsive end of the spectrum, although both of them could meet criteria for a gambling disorder. All right. Let's extract out of these behavioral addictions the technological addictions. And here is how James and I, Dr. Scherer, my co-editor of the technological addictions, and I decided to cut the pie of the technological addictions: internet gambling, internet gaming, cybersex, infobesity, social media, texting and emailing, and online auctions and shopping. As I mentioned before, we're going to be spending a little more time on internet gaming and cybersex, but I would like to spend a little bit of time in each one of the other ones. I just contained myself to one slide each for the other technological addictions. All right. So, internet gambling, a moving target. Up until 2 seconds ago, I would show a slide of the map of the United States. Do I still have it? No. A map of the United States with the different laws that try to somehow contain internet gambling. It's a losing game. The laws change, with an incredible speed. And essentially, it's the wild, wild west of people taking advantage of each other. Nobody really regulates it. And probably the most dangerous part of internet gambling has to do with sports betting. Even the name is sinister. I know sinister is the right word. It's deceiving. Betting sounds a little better than gambling. I don't gamble, I bet. So you're somewhat protected by the language here, which of course you are not. Sports betting has been seeing an explosion over the past few years, especially with the pandemic, and the projections are becoming more and more dire as the online side of sports betting is going to be skyrocketing. All right. Moving on to Infobesity. A lot of you are not gamblers and they don't do sports betting, so the previous slide may have felt safely foreign to your personal engagement with technology. I'm 100% sure that this one rings true in some aspects for all of us. All right. But of course, when it becomes a disorder, it's at the very extreme. Starting with internet surfing. This is the aimless web browsing for extended periods of time. We're talking about 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, just going through these rabbit holes of the internet, checking on the cutest cats and dogs. I mean, how many times can we see these dogs doing amazing things and the cutest possible little cats, and but also really kind of ending up in the news, checking articles that have very little true value for us, but just ending up spending so much time, losing so much time on the internet. A somewhat separate aspect of Infobesity has to do with information overload, and that is a much more focused engagement with the internet. This is when you really want to find out. I want to find out how long is COVID contagious post in people who have had the 4th dose, have had the 2nd booster. And you get lost. You start with up to date, and then you go into Wikipedia, and then that leads you to the CDC, and you try to find out from the CDC what is going on, and you go on page after page after page of things, and at the end of the day, you have just so much information that you cannot really make up your mind. Again, somewhat similar to the internet surfing, but a much more focused engagement with technology. Social media, another one that very few of us, not me, have managed to escape. And from Facebook to Instagram to TikTok to all kinds of social media engagement. These days, I have an 11-year-old niece. I mean, if you tell her to stop engaging in the social media world, she would feel like she has no friends, that she's cut off from the world. Some wonderful articles have been written about the self versus the selfie in a philosophical sense. Who are we if we're not the image that we portray in our social media profiles? And then, of course, the more relevant, psychiatrically speaking, the fear of missing out, the sense of inadequacy, the sense that other people are having a grand old time. Everybody is going to these fabulous vacations and having the hottest boyfriends and girlfriends, and here we are in our own misery, missing out in life. So there's very much an issue of self-esteem and of satisfaction with life when everybody else seems to be just so unrealistically happy and gratified all over the internet. All right, texting and emailing. Texting has been eating emailing for lunch. I feel like a goon of yesteryears for insisting that people email me and not text me. People kind of roll their eyes on me, either externally or internally. But this is what we're looking at these days. I'm bringing up this slide because this is an attempt to start looking at these technological addictions with respect to wellness. So if you see here, this is the diurnal variation of the different communication styles and apps, texting, web browsing, voicemails. And you will see that in the green light here, that voicemails are probably the ones that have the most wellness-friendly profile, where you leave voicemails and you check voicemails during the working day, but you do put it aside and you go to sleep and you don't have it wake you up or stay with you 24/7. Probably the most disturbing one is the web browsing one, going back to the infobesity addiction that we discussed, where it seems that the curve is almost flat, where you web browse essentially 24/7, with the exception of maybe 2 to 4 a.m. All right. And finally, the last one being online auctions and shopping. This is where we make the distinction between technology natives and technology immigrants. I just had my 60th birthday last week, and just by the sheer age that I carry, I am a technology immigrant. My 11-year-old niece is clearly a technology native. So what we find is that technology immigrants are particularly vulnerable to online auctions and shopping, where people, older adults, engage in, are victims of scams. I mean, how many princes have deposited, $5 billion in a London bank, waiting for us to make a withdrawal? I don't know, but even if you fool 1 or 2 people, that's probably enough for you to make your scam worthwhile. In any case, when it comes to online auctions and shopping, our biggest concern is older adults and how they can lose tremendous amounts of money in this engagement. All right, moving on to internet gaming. All right, here on the left is my very good friend and co-editor of the Technological Addictions book, Dr. James Scherer, an addiction psychiatrist now at NYU, who would be the first one to say that he has found a tremendous benefit in internet gaming in terms of career, friends, and popularity. This is just before the pandemic in one of those mega conferences that happen in New York at the Javits Center and other convention centers, and they're starting to come back up again. Let's not forget that technology and specifically internet gaming has a lot of positives, as we're going to see in a moment. And let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, the proverbial baby with the bathwater. All right, some statistics here. A lot of people play video games, average about 2 hours, 13 minutes, boys more than girls. What I like the best about the statistics is the bottom part of this slide. Do parents limit kids' screen time? When you ask parents, 94% say yes. When you ask youth, 72% say no. So probably the truth is somewhere in between, and it is a constant battle. One of the most consistent recommendations when it comes to internet gaming in the family and how to limit it and how much to limit it and whether to limit it altogether is that whatever you decide to do as a parent, whatever rule you decide to enforce, it has to be enforced for the entire family. You cannot have different rules for the kids than for the adults. You cannot have, you cannot say no to cell phones and games at the dinner table for the kids, but the adults are allowed to keep on checking their emails or playing games at the dinner table. So if you're going to have some kind of rule, it better be consistent for everyone. Okay, as advertised, there are some significant positives that have been found for internet gaming. It improves eye-hand coordination, multitasking, visual attention, visual tracking. It also sharpens mental rotation. Now, the studies that I have seen that report positive effects of internet gaming on mental rotation is very concrete, it's very specific. We're talking about objects. You have some kind of three-dimensional object in your head, and if you play a lot of internet or a lot of games, then you may be able to see that object from different points of view. Some people have made the leap into believing that internet gaming will sharpen your ability to see social phenomena from different points of view. That this kind of mental rotation translates into seeing racism and homophobia and the war on Ukraine and global warming and whatever issue you may want to think of that you can see from different angles. I think this is a stretch. I cannot see how internet gaming really helps you with this kind of social mental rotation. And then, of course, there are the negatives. Academics suffer, exercise, sleep, not hanging out with friends, and feeling lonely. Good friend of mine, Howard Rubin, you may know Howard, a psychiatrist, a wonderful psychiatrist in San Francisco. He was actually the first psychiatrist who was appointed specifically for medical student wellness, and that was at UCSF. Now many medical schools have wellness assistant teams and different czars for wellness. But anyway, he was the first one nationally. And I went up to Howard at some point. I said, okay, Howard, you are the expert on wellness. Tell me, if there was one thing that medical students need to do to safeguard their wellness, what would that be? And without flinching, Howard said, "Oh, that's very easy. That's a very easy question. Sleep, sleep. This is it. If your sleep crumbles, then everything else will fall apart." I'm not sure if it's as easy as he said, but there is something to certainly in that idea that internet gaming does have significant negative impact on sleep with severe subsequent consequences. All right. Question that are being asked quite often is, do violent games cause violence on the real world? And the answer to that is most likely no. A very recent study just showed that, in fact, people who spend a lot of time in violent video games tend to have lower rates of violence outside of their video game playing. And the reason for that is extremely straightforward. They spend so much time on the internet that they don't have time to go out and engage in real world violence. So that's not the only reason, but that idea that if you play violent video games, you're going to go out and you're going to kill a few people does not seem to be really the case. Okay, this is probably my favorite slide of this whole set. The flow state, the flow zone. This is the goal of the people who develop internet games. Internet game corporations aim to keep people like you and me in the zone of flow. This diagram does show that if the game is too hard for you, you become too anxious and you just put it aside and you stop playing. If the game is too easy for you, you become bored and then you just put it aside. And there is that kind of sweet spot somewhere in between where the game kind of titrates itself with your skill level and keeps you at exactly that point where you are fully engaged, the flow state. It reminds me very, very much of chemists who were employed by the tobacco industry back in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, back in the kind of the Mad Men type environment, whose tasks for these chemists was to find the optimal combination of chemicals in the cigarette to maximize the addictiveness of tobacco. And of course, they got in trouble eventually and we had the tobacco lawsuits and the like. But internet gaming companies employ psychologists and they have these psychology labs where they try with a lot of data and a lot of theory behind it to maximize the flow state of the user. And then, of course, we do have the microtransactions. A lot of you who play games know microtransactions very, very well. You just pay $1 or $2 and you get an extra hammer. And if you get stuck, then you can just use your virtual hammer and break through the candies and move to the next level. The child or grandchild of this, of course, the microtransactions are based in the idea that if you pay only $1 or $2, it seems very little to you, but multiply that by millions who use these games and day after day when you may be engaging in these microtransactions, that's extremely profitable for the people who own these internet games. The child or grandchild of these microtransactions are the loot boxes, which are much more expensive than the microtransactions. And they also are based on the idea of surprise You're not exactly sure what's in the loot box, but it be something that really advances you in the game, or something that may be even cosmetic, just that makes things more beautiful, have rainbows and more cute animals and so on to make it more appealing for you. All right. How is the COVID intersected with internet gaming? One of my favorite stories is the World Health Organization, who in May of 2019 declared gaming disorder as a medical condition, which of course it is. It can, in the extreme, internet gaming or gaming altogether can be and is a medical disorder. But then only a year later, the very same organization, the WHO, launched the Play Apart Together campaign, encouraging people to engage as much as possible in internet gaming to promote social distancing and reduce the transmission of COVID-19. The other thing that has come out of COVID-19 is a new style of games. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Animal Crossing, but it's a beautiful game. You have no rivals there. You live in a farm, in a utopia. There's an internal clock in the game, so when you go to sleep, the animals go to sleep. And when you wake up, the animals wake up. And everything is so beautiful and lovely. And people have said that the popularity of games like this, of utopian games like Animal Crossing, really speaks to the pandemic world, where there's so much stress and so much sadness, especially around the people who have lost loved ones due to the pandemic. All right, moving on to the other technological addiction I would like to cover, which is cybersex. Cybersex is an umbrella term. It's an all-inclusive term that includes online pornography, online dating, sex chats, sex webcams, and of course, teledildonics. Quite a few people erroneously believe that teledildonics came to town because of the pandemic. That is not true. Teledildonics were quite well developed before the pandemic, but as one would expect, they became, their development accelerated and became far more popular with the pandemic. As the etymology of the word suggests, teledildonics refers to being able to manipulate different sexual objects from far, far away places, different cities, different countries, different continents, and have sex with pretty much anyone you want across the globe by these consoles that you can, in a very sophisticated manner, manipulate, and of course, in conjunction with webcams. Online porn is probably considered in a kind of have a life of its own, that it's very easy to think about it as general porn, or it's very easy to think about it as internet addiction, but it does seem to have a space of its own. It's based on the AAA model of internet porn, accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. As I'm sure you're very well aware, there's nothing totally anonymous anymore on the internet, and highly suggest that you don't engage in any internet porn in any computers that may be also relating to your work. But for the most part, the AAA model does hold true for internet porn. Highly accessible, highly affordable, and for the most part, anonymous. Here's COVID-19, and this is a Pornhub, one of the major internet porn sites that offered premium service for free in an effort to contribute to the fight against COVID-19, to encourage people to stay at home and help flatten the curve of new COVID-19 cases. So everybody was on board in the fight against COVID. Let me just say something about porn, on the dark side of porn, there are two things that concern us in particular as mental health professionals. One is that people end up being discouraged that they cannot find sexual partners who meet the criteria, who meet the standards of what they're so used to through the internet porn. Nobody's good enough. Nobody sometimes literally measures up to what you see on the screen. But the second aspect that's also quite problematic from a psychological perspective is your self-esteem. It's not only that you don't find partners who measure up to what you see on the screen, is that you never feel adequate enough yourself as a sexual object to go out there and engage and fulfill yourself sexually. So these are significant downsides of internet porn. When it gets to the extreme, when it becomes an addiction, then that certainly can devastate a person's life. All right, online dating sites and apps. 30% of US adults date on sites and apps, and that's data from 2020, which with the speed that online dating moves, that's kind of ancient history, but that's the most recent data that we have. If you look down on this graph, you see that 55% of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals date on sites and apps, which actually does make it more the norm than the exception. There's absolutely nothing extraordinary, nothing outre, nothing kinky, nothing of any sort about online dating through sites and apps. So the popularity of online dating sites and apps has to do with incredible availability. Sex, both virtual and real, is only a click or a swipe away. Most of us feel that this incredible access is what has given, what has resulted in the popularity and explosion, really, of online dating. There's at least one psychiatrist from New York, my very good friend Steve Lee, who proposed something that is, I'm not sure how much I agree with, but it offers an angle that I find quite helpful here. Steve says, it's not the availability that made online dating so popular, it's actually exactly the opposite. If you decide to date on sites and apps, your life is one of constant rejection. There are only 24 hours in a day, and you constantly reject people, and you constantly get rejected all the time. And only rarely, infrequently, and somewhat unpredictably, in a classic variable ratio, intermittent reinforcement fashion, you may have an actual event, which, as you very well remember from Psychology 101, this is the best way to promote a behavior, the best way to fight extinction of a learned behavior, the variable intermittent reinforcement. And maybe that's what's operating here. All right. GRINDR, the granddaddy of internet, of dating apps. I'm sure everybody knows about GRINDR in this audience. For a couple of you who may not, it's a gay internet-based, GPS-based app where essentially you are on GRINDR and somebody else in the vicinity may be on GRINDR as well, and you can exchange pictures and you can hook up right there and then. It's a very, very easy way of meeting people. And in 2022, the dating apps have really exploded and become very specialized. There are specific apps for gay men who like people with facial hair or with no facial hair, or the particular body habitus, or this or that. My favorite is Tinder, that is becoming now quite popular among gay men. It's of course, Tinder is a straight app, but actually caters more to a combination of romance and sex, as contrasted to some of the other internet apps that may be more focused on sexual experiences. So there you have it. The straights are coming to the rescue of the gays in this particular situation. All right. Moving on to assessment and diagnosis. This is going to go fast. Why? Because we don't really have anything dramatically different to offer other than what we know about addiction in general. The things that we have known about addiction to opioids and tobacco and alcohol and cocaine do come to our help when it comes to the behavioral addictions and the technological addictions more specifically. So how do I know that my patient is addicted to technology? Probably one of the most common questions that I'm being asked: how do you define that line between normal use and pathological use? As you very well know from the world of substances, there are substances that are quite dichotomous. The majority of people who smoke cigarettes either smoke cigarettes or don't. Yes, there are very, very few people who may have a cigarette every once in a while, but for the most part, you're either a tobacco user or you're not. Other substances are a little more difficult to define. Alcohol, for example. We do have people who drink only recreationally and very infrequently have absolutely no problem with alcohol, but we have other people who are really on that cusp that we're not quite sure if they are problematic drinkers or not. Our best way is to go through diagnostic criteria, as a little clumsy as they may be. And here, what I have in the next few slides is how we have adopted the substance use criteria, essentially, in the world of technological addictions. So, 4 major buckets, 4 major areas, the very, very same way that we do it in the substances of abuse. We start with physiology, tolerance and withdrawal, wanting to play more and more games to get the same satisfaction, or if you abruptly stop playing games or you abruptly stop looking at internet porn, you have a withdrawal syndrome characterized by irritability, tantrums in children, hopelessness and despair in adults. They're very basic tolerance and withdrawal. And in the same way that for substances, tolerance and withdrawal are major components of addiction, but essentially are neither necessary nor sufficient conditions to give somebody the diagnosis of addiction. In a similar way, in the technological addictions, they are very much big part of the addiction, but they are neither necessary nor sufficient conditions. All right. Second bucket, the internal preoccupation, the internal worries. They're always living with a particular technology, never being able to disengage, a major word in 2022 in terms of wellness and our altogether kind of relationship with our world. How do we disengage? It's almost impossible for somebody who suffers from the technological addiction to disengage from her or his technology of choice. You try to cut down, you can't, and you also attempt to relieve negative moods. A little bit of a self-medication component here. I'm anxious, and I go to my internet porn site, and I'm not anxious anymore. Or I feel down, and I get my Candy Crush saga, and I forget about it. The third major bucket is the external consequences. Your job starts getting affected by it. Your relationships going south. No more hobbies other than the particular technology that you're engaged in. And I put here in purple a somewhat different one, and that is deceiving loved ones. This one comes straight out of the literature in gambling. The lie bet test, a wonderful instrument in gambling that has only two questions. The first one is very obvious. Do you ever bet more than you intended? But the second one is somewhat new, and it says, do you lie to people important to you about your activities? And of course, deceiving loved ones is a very big part of addiction in general, but it hasn't made the DSM in such a crisp way as, let's say, in the lie bet test. So that is something that's emerging as an important criterion for technological addictions. Here is the lie bet test. It's not that new. It's an old one, 1997, but it has been a renewed interest, especially on that second question: have you ever had to lie to people important to you about how much you gambled? It turns out that having at least one person in our lives to whom we don't lie is essential for our mental health. Yes, we may lie to people right and left about all kinds of things, but having at least one person to whom we are honest is quite essential. That comes out of the literature for teenage suicide. Before the internet, you grow up in a highly homophobic environment where you cannot go to your parents, certainly not your parents, certainly not your teachers, certainly not the priest, certainly not anyone in your town to come out as an LGBTQ person, and you feel incredibly, incredibly lonely with devastating results in your mental health. Enter the internet, and the internet provided a tremendous relief from that kind of isolation, because now a kindred spirit is only a click away, and that has helped tremendously people, especially youth across the globe, who may be finding themselves in highly homophobic, highly stressful situations. All right, I'm digressing here a little bit. Back to diagnostic criteria, and there's a fourth bucket of how we understand addiction. It's the physiological part, the internal preoccupation, the external consequences, and maybe in its own category, the core symptom of addiction from a phenomenological perspective: continued use despite knowledge of adverse consequences. I know it's bad for me, but I cannot help it. Continued use despite knowledge of adverse consequences. All right. Final chapter here, treatments. Also gonna go a little fast here because we don't have that much data on it. What can I do about it? What can I do for my patient or for myself if I find myself in this kind of situation? All right, here is brief counseling. If you don't have much time, if this is all you have for your patient, this is the outline of the briefest possible counseling. It has great evidence behind it for alcohol use disorders, and the late Richard Sates, who proposed it, has done incredible work with it. It doesn't seem to work quite as well for cocaine and opioids, but we extrapolate from it, and we think that something like this may be helpful for the technological addictions as well. So, of course, you're empathic and curious. You follow up and refer. These are bookends that apply pretty much to everything we do. But the three major ingredients of brief counseling are the following. First, you state your medical or clinical findings. This is what I see here. This is a psychiatric disorder, very much like depression and schizophrenia and other addictions that we know. And I see here that you lost your job. I see that you you sleep only 2 hours every night. Whatever it is, the results of your evaluation. The next step, you educate the patient about problematic use and addiction of the particular technology. This is what we now know. These this is the evidence that we have. These are possible treatments for it. And then you advise the patient for next step. Hopefully the patient may have an aha moment and bring the two things together, the findings of the evaluation and the education about the illness of the particular technological addiction. Okay, in terms of medications, no FDA-approved medications for any technological addictions. This is not just a regulatory requirement for me to make sure to say that, but it is true. Make sure to treat any co-occurring psychiatric illnesses. A lot of the evidence that we have in the technological addictions has been fraught by misdiagnosis. Quite often, families and patients are more attracted to an internet gaming diagnosis, for example, than, let's say, schizophrenia or some other devastating psychiatric illness. So no matter what, a thorough psychiatric evaluation that lead to perhaps other psychiatric diagnoses that have robust pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatments is certainly due. So back to the very beginning of this presentation, when we talked about the impulsivity, compulsivity spectrum of the behavioral addictions. If you consider your patient to have an impulsivity form of the technological addiction, you may want to consider an opioid antagonist. Naltrexone is the most common one that we have in this country. Reduces perhaps the high of the addictive behavior and therefore keeps the patient safe. Not robust data behind it, but this would be the thinking behind using perhaps naltrexone in a patient with an impulsivity form of a technological addiction. As you probably guessed, if your patient falls on the compulsivity end of the spectrum, then perhaps an SSRI could be helpful, very much the same way that we think about obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders and help your patient stay safe. This is just for the pharmacological treatments. We do also have psychosocial treatments for that. I don't know why they're not here actually. Oh, because of the counseling, I guess. But I'm delighted that Dr. Miller is coming to give a lecture on motivational interviewing next month. The classic psychosocial interventions of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, perhaps mindfulness, as we use it now in substance use disorders, also could help our patients with the technological addictions. So what we know about treating addiction in general fully applies to the technological addictions as well, with the exception perhaps of 12-step facilitation. Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step programs have been incredibly helpful to patients with substance use disorders. We're not sure that Gamblers Anonymous, for example, or other 12-step programs for behavioral addictions or technological addictions more specifically are as helpful. That we're not quite sure about. Okay, and here is our conclusions for the day. The major technological addictions: internet gambling, internet gaming, cybersex, infobesity, social media, texting and emailing, and online auctions and shopping, the major blocks of the technological addictions. In terms of diagnosis, the core symptom of addiction, continued use despite knowledge of adverse consequences, survives in the world of the technological addictions. Finally, thank you. Here is the psychosocial treatments for the technological addictions: brief counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, possibly mindfulness exercises are effective psychosocial treatments for the technological addictions. But in terms of medications, we have come short, and we don't really have any FDA-approved medications for the technological addictions. And with that, I want to thank you, and I also would like to thank my colleagues. I would like to thank my co-workers particularly James Scherer, who helped me tremendously in putting this volume together. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and Andrew for our discussion. And I'm going to stop sharing, I think, here, so that we can see each other. Oh, you do it for me?
Thank you, Petros, so much. So good to hear from you. I would like to spend actually the next couple of hours talking about all of this. It's there's just so much here. So we'll now open it up to the Q&A part of our grand round. So everybody out there, please turn to the Q&A function and go ahead and type in the chat, and we'll go ahead and talk about the questions as they come in. First, I want to get us started by introducing who you know, Dr. Andrew Gerber, who is our president at Silver Hill and medical director. And Andrew, thank you so much for joining me here for this conversation. And maybe you want to start us off with some thoughts or reactions or questions.
Sure, I'd love to, Jeff, and thank you, Petros, for as I knew you would be, and I'm sure everybody who hasn't heard you now knows, just a marvelous speaker and crystallize out, a complicated area which you made so straightforward and organized. It's funny, I was talking to my teenage daughter this morning, and I was recounting a quote which I've always loved, which is, when all truth goes through 3 stages. First, they ridicule it, then they vehemently disagree with it, and then they regard it as self-evident. And I think that, even in my career, I've seen the concept of behavioral addictions go from something that was considered faddish to something that was disagreed with, to now, I imagine many of us find it self-evident, right? It's such a compelling description of the situation with so many of our patients, and certainly here at Silver Hill, even though we don't identify ourselves as a primary, doing primary treatment for behavioral addictions, it is, as I'm sure you can imagine, so common. So I had a few questions I wanted to ask you. So one is a clinical dilemma that I've faced myself in my practice, and I imagine others have as well. And that is the situation of somebody with a lot of social isolation, even before COVID. The person I'm thinking of in particular was a young man with Asperger's, who actually found that he blossomed in a certain way through internet connectivity. And unfortunately, it became a very contentious issue in his family because they labeled it early on as completely pathological, when I think I at least saw there were elements of positive social interaction for someone who really had very unsuccessful social interactions prior to that. And then it became this point where it was black or white. It was either all bad or all good, as opposed to a more nuanced view. And I struggled, I have to say, with the family and with this young man because he did overuse it. There's no question that he did retreat into it and do all the sort of, he wasn't so impulsive, but he was certainly compulsive things. So I'm curious about your thoughts about how to kind of, what I assume is move away from that kind of black or white categorization.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. It goes back to that idea of not throwing the baby with the bathwater, in that people find a tremendous community in these groups. If you find that in that particular situation, your patient exclusively uses the internet and doesn't even entertain the possibility of a real human interaction, I would suggest perhaps some of these events that happen specifically for people who engage in these technologies. So there are actual humans behind the avatars, and these actual humans do meet and do exchange ideas and do fall in love with one another and date and do all kinds of things within the context of having a passion for technology, a passion for internet gaming. So if somehow you can suggest one or two of those real life events that are based on the gaming world, that may be a helpful step for your patient.
No, you're right on point, and I've seen this man for a number of years, and in fact, there have been points where he did exactly that, and it's been very gratifying and successful for him when he's gone and met with people. This leads into a second question, and then I'll let Jeff open it up to everybody else. And this is obviously somewhat of a question, a professional question here at Silver Hill. I've noticed there are some residential facilities that have now started to advertise themselves as having programs for behavioral addiction. We do not. And I'd be interested to get your opinion, and probably in general. Are they helpful? Is it more of a gimmick? Are there advantages to kind of a residential treatment for folks who are really struggling with this?
I do have quite a few ideas about this, and I'm very happy to share them with you. It is somewhat of a gimmick, but if you know what you're doing, then you could offer tremendous help to these people. I get phone calls all the time. Tell me about, I don't care how expensive it is. I don't care what it takes. Tell me the best possible place on earth for my kid who suffers from, this kind of addiction. And of course, what I tell them is your kid needs a competent clinician, a competent psychiatrist or psychologist or social worker or nurse practitioner or physician assistant or counselor who knows addiction and can help your kid with the addiction aspect. And then, you can expand and see if there's some kind of very specific idea from somebody about the particular technological addiction. But the core of the problem, and that's because of two reasons. One is that we don't have that much data, we don't have that much evidence, we don't have specialized treatments for technological addiction. So what are we talking about here? So it's not like you're going to do something different than what you do like at a great place like Silver Hill or some other ones in the country. And the second reason is that I do believe deep in my heart that the underlying engine is very similar among these behavioral addictions and the substance disorders. That's why gambling moved into the addiction chapter of the DSM-5 as a sign that we appreciate that what is at the core of addiction is very, very similar across the board. And if you have the expertise in treating addiction, as Silver Hill does, then I'm sure you can do a great job with technological addictions as well. Short of pharmacotherapy. Pharmacotherapy is a little different. Yes, there's unique pharmacotherapy for opioids, there's unique pharmacotherapy for tobacco and so on. So that is a little different, but the psychotherapy part, the psychosocial parts of treatment are pretty much identical. Again, with the exception of the 12-step, which I'm not quite sure about.
Thank you very much. Jeff.
Petros, a question for you. Thanks again for brilliant presentation. And we have a long line of chat questions out there. I just intrigued a little bit when you reference your 11-year-old niece and this whole idea of kind of the growing knowledge gap between grown-ups and children around internet technology that grows each year. And are there recommendations, books, policy statement, anything for parents or families about how to raise kids around the internet and kind of that conversation, even from, the many questions that come, when should my kid get a cell phone, to how do we talk about what's happening on the internet at the dinner table or anything like that, that kind of conceptualizes the role of the family around the internet technologies.
The pediatricians are a little ahead of us in this matter, and they have put out some advisements, some documents that they can be quite helpful. So I would look in the pediatric literature for that instead of the psychiatric one, although I hope that we develop some of these documents as well. We don't have that much evidence about it. It is this is my, I keep on saying the same thing here, but there is a disrespect from us older folks to the new way of interacting that my 11-year-old has. My 11-year-old is in touch with her friends 24/7.
Right.
And we frown upon that. And we think that the quality of the friendship cannot possibly be as good as the quality of our friendships when we would stay there late at night, sometimes drinking, and having really wonderful conversations with our friends. I'm not so sure about that. The fact that they are exchanging information and thoughts, behaviors, and feelings in real time may be better for their mental health and their overall development than the classic non-virtual friendships. And of course, there's a great combination of the two. I mean, my niece, I keep on referring to her, she has a best friend, they see each other all the time, but they could be in the same room and they could still text each other. So it's a new world for sure.
Yes. All right, I'm going to turn to the chat here, and just going down. We have first a big hello from Karen Haberlin, who wanted to share some information and says that is a researcher in mass communication and recently co-authored an article about motivations for mobile gaming and when these motivations can get risky. And they found a relationship between materialism and internet addiction. And there's a citation there in the chat that can send you. Any kind of thoughts about that?
I would love to read the article. I hadn't thought about materialism as being part of this somehow. Up until this very moment, I would think that materialism is orthogonal to internet addiction, and you can be highly materialistic or not and be equally vulnerable to internet addiction. But I would be delighted to see this article, and maybe they're not as orthogonal as I thought.
Great. Richard Francis writes in, yes, and says, first two words, great talk. A major expansion of addiction psychiatry to include most of life, including French fries. As a new president of the APA, how can we get American psychiatry to embrace addiction psychiatry more than has been the case?
Doing exactly what you're doing, Francis. I mean, there has never been a better advocate for addiction psychiatry than Richard. Richard Francis has single-handedly done more for addiction psychiatry than all of us. So what can the APA do? I think we may not have had that many addiction psychiatrists in the leadership of the APA. So at least in a very organic fashion, I can totally see how addiction psychiatry will be more considered. The other thing I have to say is that the APA very often sees psychiatry with the lens of psychiatric comorbidities. And that is, of course, a huge part of what we do. And we should certainly pay a lot of attention to dual diagnosis, co-occurring psychiatric disorders. But there is such thing as addiction in itself. The opioid epidemic really taught us that there are a bunch of people out there who can very easily end up suffering from very severe forms of opioid addiction without having any depression, anxiety, or any other psychiatric problems. And so there is a space there for great both scientific investigation and treatment options for people who suffer from just addiction.
Great. There's a question coming in with regard to social media and teenagers. If fully addicted, but they can't completely abstain, how does one address that?
Yeah, we rely so much on our engagement with technology that a fully abstinence strategy is not really available to us. I can think of the eating disorders as perhaps an example where, as it's often said, you have to walk the tiger 3 times a day. You cannot put the tiger in a cage and throw away the key, as we can do with the substance use disorders. You have to engage with the thing that gives you grief pretty much all the time. So there are some people who have managed to cut down on their technology engagement. There may be some cultural aspects here as well. I emailed a very good friend of mine, fellow psychiatrist in Toronto, about something that I needed. And 3-4 days later, he hadn't responded, and I know him so well that it didn't seem like him. So I mailed him back and I said, you know, did you get my email? And he writes back and he said, I only check emails on Fridays. I go like, whoa! I can't imagine in the United States having any kind of institution where we can say comfortably, I only check my emails on Fridays. But there are other cultures who may be more
have other things
ahead of us.
Yes.
More evolved.
Yes, they've managed to figure this out a little bit. Yes. So Aaron Corcoran writes in about curiosity, where addiction to video games comes in, especially kids addicted to watching YouTube and TV shows on handheld devices.
Yeah, that particular one, especially with TikTok, became quite big recently with the Wall Street Journal article on Tourette syndrome. I don't know if you followed that. Some kids allegedly developed Tourette's by watching TikToks all the time and having these kind of consequences. My take on it is that either the kids already had Tourette's and that became kind of evident, declared itself because they were watching these videos, or it was a hype that you know, one kid told another that I have Tourette's, and then it became kind of a fad more than anything else. So in general, I would say that people absolutely can get addicted to these technologies. I'm not sure how toxic the technologies that themselves are to our brains. You know, in some ways, I think about opioids here. You can get absolutely tremendously, you know, addicted to opioids, devastating your life on opioids, but the molecules themselves are not of the kind like, for example, like alcohol, where they're going to go and chew up different parts of your brain. So without having any data to support what I just said, it feels to me that it's the addiction that we're most concerned about, not any direct toxic effects of these technologies.
A couple of questions coming in, kind of wondering about your ideas about a harm reduction model versus an abstinence model for what we're talking about. And Matt Krause writes in as an example, a client who was playing 3 to 5 hours a day and up to 6 on the weekends reduced their use to 1 to 2 hours a day.
Yeah. Similar concepts that apply to the substances, in my mind. If you are able to pursue an abstinence-based model, you may be more in a your brain may relax a little bit to a kind of a simpler way of sustaining your recovery. Moderation management plans are by nature messier, but they may be more effective for other people who cannot fully disengage from the activity, maybe for professional reasons, or maybe because their illness is such that they cannot really fully disengage from it. So once again, I would greatly borrow from our vast knowledge of how we understand addiction in general. And is this Mark Krause, my wonderful friend Mark Krause? You know, in ASAM, we have gone to great lengths to say this is addiction, not addictions. It's the concept, the core pathology is quite similar across different manifestations of the illness.
Great. We have a question here. You're in the co-occurring idea. Is technological addiction related at all to ADHD?
Yes and no. There have been quite a few articles making that correlation, mostly in the area of relief of uncomfortable affects. of uncomfortable moods. So when the ADHD gets particularly problematic, when the symptoms are such that they are very bothersome to the person, this particular person may self-medicate with technology and find some relief from it. I know that I work in like you do, all of you, in situations where you go into a meeting and you have somebody next to you who plays video games, and then at least one person turned and told me, said, I have ADHD, and that's the only way that I can sit through a meeting is by playing a video game. So there is that.
Matt Krause writes in that he is Mark's son.
Ah, really? Wow. Okay.
Yes. There you go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Say
So
hi to your dad.
Paula Gibson writes in that the addiction process seems comparable to an eating or sex disorder where abstinence is not realistic, and helping someone find boundaries and limits, maybe more similar to some prior questions, but further thoughts about that?
I think it's the same question as before about the motivation management, essentially.
Great. Great. I think we've gone through the questions. Do you have any kind of final thoughts to share with us, you or Dr. Gerber?
I have one that I want to make sure that I may have mentioned a couple of times throughout the talk, but a good diagnosis will go a very, very long way. Some of the original data, especially from Singapore and from South Korea, did show very high rates of internet gaming addiction. And when we look a little closer, a lot of these patients, especially youth, had other issues, ADHD and depression, and sometimes bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, who were not really helped by the diagnosis of internet gaming disorder, because the treatments would have been very, very different if they've been given the correct diagnosis of other psychiatric disorders that the youth suffered from. So even if you're pretty sure that you have a technological addiction at hand, do look very closely to the diagnosis and see if there's something else operating there as well.
Great. Any final words for us, Andrew?
Just want to say thank you to Petros, and it's so exciting to hear all the developments, and I look forward to having you back on other topics, but also as we do gather more data. I imagine we're going to be hearing from you and learning from you in the future. Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Lewis, for a very educational and inspiring presentation. We're very grateful for your speaking to us today and in the past, and hopefully again in the future. Thank you everyone for joining us. As a reminder, for those wishing to receive CME and CEC credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically pop up in the browser as the webinar ends. I like to say that we've been connected here as a community learning together, and now the internet will send us off into our own isolated spaces, and it's a little bit jarring. So in advance of that, Petros, thank you again so much for being with us, and here we go. This concludes our grand rounds, everybody. So have a great day.
Bye now.